Welcome back to my video series on the return of Digby after 20 years. This is part 6. If you have not watched the first 5 parts, there's a link in the description below this video that will take you to that playlist. It's important to watch those other videos so you know what I'm talking about here in part 6. Now you remember, we adjusted the valve clearances, we inspected the camshaft. In the last video we did a compression test, and we found out we have a weak cylinder on number 3. We weren't even getting 200 psi. It was around 175 to 180. And that's a pretty good reason why that engine would drop a cylinder at idle. It just does not have enough compression to fire the diesel fuel when the engine's idling. So you're all wondering, okay, is Digby dead or is Digby dying? Some of you are saying, well, how could this be? I mean, these Mercedes diesels are supposed to go 1,000,000 miles, right? And how could it be that in this engine with approximately 200,000 miles or a little more is suddenly dying on cylinder number? It's mechanical, okay? Things happen. It's just an engine. There's no way you can determine why something like this might happen on certain engines and not on others. You know, it's just the nature of the beast. But there are some indicators that are making me think maybe there's hope for Digby. So guess what? I walked into the shop this morning and I've been gone for a week. I've been out of town and I just had to try something. I'm really curious this morning. I've been gone out of town. Nothing has changed. The compression tester is still hooked up to number 3 cylinder. I'm just going to crank it over and see what compression we have now. 320 pounds, well, that's acceptable compression. It shows you that all that oil didn't just drain off the rings fairly quickly, so maybe there is hope. So that's pretty interesting, right? 310 to 320 psi after it had been sitting here a week. You know, this means to me that we've got an issue with the piston rings. It's probably not the piston. It's probably not scored cylinder walls because we don't have that typical piston slap noise that you get from either a wrist pin or a piston land that's slapping against the cylinder and making a knocking sound. There's no knocks in this engine other than injector noise. So I'm thinking, okay, it's time for some alternative medicine. And you're probably chuckling, thinking, what in the world are you talking about, Ken? You'll find out soon enough. What I want to do is talk about 6 indicators that lead me to believe there's still hope. These 6 indicators you've seen in the last 5 videos, but I just want to review them so you can kind of understand where I'm coming from. The first indicator that caught my attention was how well Digby started without pre-glowing the glow system. You know, I just got in the car and cranked away. Watch again as I do this procedure. Now you'll notice that the engine starts up and runs rough here, but it starts pretty quickly without a lot of glowing. So that kind of was an indication that the general health of the engine is pretty good. And number 2 right behind that was the minimal blow-by. And I determined that by doing the cap dance test. Watch here, see what happens. And check this out, blow-by. Very minimal cap dance there. See what happens when I loosen up the cap? Now, if you have bad blow-by, that cap will blow off the engine. It'll jump up and down at least a half to 1 inch. So I'm thinking this engine doesn't really have that much blow-by. Now, if it had a broken piston or broken piston rings, you would get excessive blow-by. That cap would just fly off the engine. So that was a really good indicator, indicator number 2. Now, number 3 was how smooth the engine would run once you brought it off idle. You get it up a little over 2,000 RPM. Listen again. Still running rough at idle. You know, it'll smooth out at about 2,000 RPM. You see what I mean? Once I brought that up, then that engine would smooth right out. And then, you remember when I got it out on the road, let's go back out on the road together. As I'm sitting here at the stop sign, it's actually starting to run a little better. Now it sounds like it's only missing on 1 cylinder. Let's see how it goes, all the way up to 60. Now it's smoking less. 60. And look at that, you can see how that thing just went right up to 60 miles an hour like most turbo diesels. You know, it wasn't the fastest I've ever driven, it certainly wasn't the slowest either. So then, coming back, the next indicator was how well it ran after that road test. I called it a mini Italian tune-up. It was just kind of around, around the farm a few times, you know, flooring the car, but just a slight improvement. You can see it's still missing, but the engine was running much smoother. And then look at the other indicator in the back. As I looked around behind at the smoke, you saw the earlier videos where this thing was just smoking like crazy. Well, just that short trip improved the smoke. And then let's look at that compression again. Okay, go ahead and turn it over. Okay, hold it. Look at that, 400 PSI, that's what it should be. You know, look at that compression again. You can see here, I'm adding the engine oil to the cylinder and I'm letting it sit for about 45 minutes. You know, I'm turning over to blow the excess out, but look at how quickly it came up to 400 PSI, just adding a small amount of oil into that number 3 cylinder. So that was really a good indication to me. You can imagine if you would have had to crank it through 10, 12 compression cycles and just maybe it'd strain up there to maybe 300 or 320, you know, well, that would be an indication that it may be excessively worn piston rings. And of course, coming in this morning, it was so funny. I walk in here and says, man, this thing's been sitting for a week. You know, if the piston rings are really worn out, where there's broken rings, that oil would just drain away and we wouldn't get much better than 200 PSI, and it came right up over 300. So because of these 6 indicators, I believe that we either have piston rings that are stuck in the grooves in the pistons, or we have piston rings that have lost their seat, either through excess wear or carbon buildup or whatever. So what I want to try to do is wake up those piston rings in cylinder number 3. Well, how do you wake them up? Okay, this is where we bring on the alternative medicine. All right, follow along here as I try to explain. What I want to do is I want to try to add some extreme lubrication to cylinder number 3 to try to see if we can't get those piston rings to come back to life. And that's particularly true if they're kind of stuck or they're carboned up. So there's 4 things I'm going to do. Right off, I'm going to go ahead and change the other 3 fuel injectors just because those first 2 were in very good condition. That's not going to directly affect what I'm going to do here. But the first thing I'm going to do is change the engine oil. Get rid of the engine oil that's in the engine. I have no idea what kind of oil's in there. And I'm going to add this oil right here that has a high content of molybdenum disulfate. Now you're thinking, well, what's so great about that? Well, this particular compound has one of the best anti-friction capabilities of any out there. And you're going to say, well, Kent, that sounds like snake oil to me. Well, you know, I was doing some research on this, and this particular additive for oil was developed about 40 years ago for aircraft engines. That's piston-driven aircraft engines. And, you know, me being a pilot and an aircraft mechanic, says, oh, yeah, that's my kind of product there. But what they wanted to come up with was an additive to the oil that would allow the engine to keep running for a while in the event of loss of oil pressure or loss of oil. And of course, run long enough to land or get back on the ground. And so that's why this particular additive was developed about 40 years ago. And Liqui-Moly puts it in their high mileage diesel and gasoline oil. It's a part synthetic, part Adeno oil. I've had great success with this oil. I've had 2 cars that have, one of them miraculously stopped burning oil. It had been burning oil about a quart every 1,000 miles. It just quit. And the other one really slowed it down. And then on another engine that had hydraulic lifters, I was able to quiet a lifter with this particular oil. So I've become a great fan of this oil. Now you got to remember that a turbo diesel Mercedes has oilers at the bottom of the cylinders that's spraying oil up onto the cylinder as the piston is moving up and down. It's really important to understand this. So if I put this oil in there and I can get a lot of molybdenum, that's really a mouthful, disulfate, up on that cylinder and create some real anti-friction and lubrication in those rings, that's going to help. Now the second thing I want to do is introduce a high lubrication content into the fuel. Most of you know that the current diesel on the market does not have any lubrication. They remove the sulfur from diesel fuel for environmental reasons. So unless you put an additive in your fuel tank, you're not getting the lubrication. Now remember, injector number 3 was really bad. And who knows, maybe it had been washing down the cylinder because it wasn't firing properly, that just led to kind of a snowball effect of the rings wearing, maybe kind of overheating, maybe sticking, whatever. Once again, we're talking about hope here. There's no guarantee. So what I'm going to do is add pure vegetable oil to the fuel tank. This is 100% canola oil, high quality vegetable oil. I'm going to put 3 gallons of vegetable oil in the fuel tank and 1 gallon of diesel. And I'm going to add about a cup of this to get some molybdenum disulfide into the fuel. Now you're thinking, well, Kent, why are you using vegetable oil? Why don't you just dump a bunch of engine oil in the tank? Well, you're going to smoke the whole neighborhood out. What's so nice about adding vegetable oil? The engine will actually burn cleaner. The smoke will disappear. It'll smell better. And it'll also create some lubrication in that upper cylinder, as at the same time we're adding lubrication to the lower part of the cylinder. And then, number 4, we're going to give this baby an Italian tune-up. I know you guys have been around cars, know what I'm talking about. But this term was developed years ago, by Ferrari. People would buy these Ferrari cars and they'd leave them parked. They wouldn't drive them enough, so they had to give them Italian tune-ups, which means get out there, redline it, blow the carbon out. Now you don't really need to do this with modern engines that have, better lubricants, more efficient fuel injection. But on these old engines, a lot of times the carburation wasn't exact, the oils weren't that great. You would get carbon buildup in the engine, and so they came up with this term Italian tune-up. What that means for these old diesels is I'm going to run this thing at high RPM for at least an hour, and hopefully under load. So that means I'm going to take a trip up into the mountains and really put the pedal to the metal. And that's what I'm going to do for old Digby here. Is this going to work? Well, I'm thinking maybe 50-50, okay? I've had some pretty good experience with this in the past. This is kind of an extreme example where you've got, pretty good compression. I didn't do a compression test on the 4 cylinders, but I could tell they're up there, and you've got this one really weak one. But once again, back to those indicators, I have hope. I think it may work. We'll come back in the next part in this series after I complete my Italian tune-up, and you're going to get to see firsthand whether or not this works or it doesn't work.